And he says, if you dare to say anything about this, this is between you and I. This is family stuff. You don't share it with anybody. And if you dare to say anything, you will get it later.
He started to kick me, he threw me to the ground, and I didn't know how to protect myself. I just curled up. I thought, this is where I die, right here.
And every single night he sat in front of us and he cleaned that .357 Magnum and he warned us, anybody ever tried to take his children from him, they were gonna die.
I was told the only way out of my marriage was in a pine box.
Domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous calls for service. They are unpredictable and highly volatile. They can quickly escalate, placing everyone on the scene in harm's way.
In the courtroom, domestic violence cases are some of the most difficult cases to prosecute. Many victims are fearful of participating in the court process. In order to effectively prosecute these cases, we must often gather evidence that can be used in place of victims' testimony.
We are here today to offer tips to keep you safe on these calls and to help you gather evidence for successful prosecution. More than 500 police officers, prosecutors, and victim advocates helped develop a list of recommended practices, known as a protocol model, for responding to domestic violence crimes at the misdemeanor level.
The model suggests successful practices in responding to these crimes. This training video was developed to help you implement these practices. The goal is to have a more effective response to domestic violence across our region.
By using these practices, the time and energy you invest in responding to calls will reduce the chances of you having to return to the same location over and over. Even small changes to how we do our work can reduce the need for follow-up, save your department money, move cases to trial quicker, and put more abusers behind bars.
We thank you for your dedication to making our communities safer. Next, we will hear from Renee Tenney and Jason Stevens, who will be our hosts as we explore 4 opportunities to enhance our work on domestic violence-related crimes.
Thank you, Barbara. By intervening quickly in misdemeanor cases, we can put an end to the violence before it has a chance to escalate.
Our first training segment provides a review on how police officers and victim advocates can respond safely to domestic violence calls.
It's important to consider your personal welfare. You're going to be traveling through different parts of the city that you're working in, and some of those areas are known or have a reputation for violence. So take good care of yourself as you're responding in there. Know where you're going, take those direct routes. If you're asked to stage off at a location, stage at a location where you can travel in any direction of travel. You can go forward, you can go left, you can go right. So if something does go wrong, you can take care of yourself and you can get yourself out of that situation. One important thing to remember as you're responding, and possibly you're in a crisis response van, is you are in an all-access vehicle, really, to whatever city you're working in. So it's important to take good care of that vehicle and not let anybody take possession of it really from you. So it's incumbent upon you to secure that vehicle, make sure that you check out the vehicle and it's in good operating order. As you're responding to calls, we always talk about looking and listening, coming from an area of safety. So when you arrive, get out of the vehicle, approach, look and listen to what's going on before you just go ahead and knock on that door. Give yourself an opportunity to make a decision whether it's a good idea to engage there, maybe to get some more resources to help you out if it's not a situation that you feel is quite safe. Time in many cases is on your side. We don't need to rush into these things. Knock, look, listen, and as you're addressing the person at the door, they're going to come to you. If somebody says come into the house, it's probably not a good idea. They need to come out to the door, open the door, you can look, you can listen, you can assess if it's a good idea to enter the residence. And from that, if you decide to go in and you're part of that crisis response capability and you decide at any point, I don't need to be here, it's probably time to back out. Each one of your agencies has provided you with a radio. In many cases, or in that one case where something does go wrong, that's going to be your lifeline to law enforcement, the fire department. So make sure you have that with you through your entire shift, and certainly as you're out on these calls. The areas of residences that typically have weapons are the bedrooms. Typically weapons like guns can be found in bedrooms, and typically things like knives can be found, of course, in the kitchen. So think about that when you're in these residences, especially as you're approaching a violent scene and areas of the residence where you want to make sure that you stay with the person that you're there to deal with, and for your own personal safety. Park at a location before you get to that address, because if somebody does have bad intentions and you pull past the address, they'll have an idea that you're there, how many people are coming. So if it's you yourself or you, your partner, it's better to park at a location before you get to that address and give yourself the opportunity to walk up on the address, as opposed to having somebody know that you've arrived and giving them the opportunity to make a decision that you might not want them to make. As you arrive, knocking on that door, standing to the side of it is important, because bad things have happened in the past to people who have stood directly in front of the door. Give yourself the opportunity to be successful by bringing them to the door, answering the door. So the old, hey, come on in, that doesn't really cut it in many of these circumstances. So think about that as you arrive. And then as far as resources out there, if you're comfortable in the scene and you're going to engage with these folks for a long time, those police officers that arrive out there that are working with you as a crisis responder, they can stay, they can go, depending on the conversations that you have. And probably I'd like to leave you with that idea. You need to have that conversation with the police officer that you're out there with. So officers, engage those crisis responders, because they might not be comfortable in those situations. And crisis responders, engage those officers and let them know if you've achieved a comfort level in this location where you can engage with these people alone, or if not, that is absolutely fine. Domestic violence incidents are some of the least predictable and most violent situations that we can engage ourselves in. So as we're responding out there as police, fire, crisis responders, taking care of business is our #1 priority, but we can't do that unless we do it safely. So your #1 priority is your personal safety. So for us to take care of business, you have to take care of yourself.
So here are some tips for crisis responders who'll be working with the police department on domestic violence calls. One of the most important things is to first remember that you get invited to that call. You're not just to show up simply because you heard that there was a call out there that needed or could potentially use a crisis interventionist or victim advocate. It's important to know before you even get on scene, what are the roles of the officers that you may come in contact with. For instance, typically the officers on the far end or the external edge of the crime scene are newer officers who may not know that you were called to the crime scene and may not know what your role is. So make sure that you're able to introduce yourself and identify yourself. If you're not in a vehicle or in a uniform that identifies yourself clearly, make sure that you have your ID with you. Next is be patient. It's going to take a while for the officer who is on the outside of the crime scene to possibly get in contact with the individuals that actually want you to help the victims or the witnesses on scene. So just be patient. When the yellow crime scene tape is up, even though we're invited to the scene, it doesn't give us the right to go past that crime scene tape without permission. So one of the first things you'll want to ask is, once you get permission to pass that line, is where do they want you to go and how do they want you to get there? There's evidence everywhere, and don't assume that just because you don't see it, there isn't evidence. So you want to make sure that you're walking the path that will cause the least interruption to that crime scene. So ask an officer to take you where you need to go. Once you're on the crime scene and you're talking to the officers or the detectives who've requested your assistance, you'll want to ask them for a summary of what's happened. You need to know who the people are that you'll be talking to and how they're related to that scene. You want to know information that you can or cannot share with them. Oftentimes, because we're there and we're in the role of assisting police officers, they give us information that they may not want the victims or witnesses to know. Please keep in mind it's important to know what information you can and cannot share with your witnesses. And again, you definitely want to know what role do they play in that scene. Sometimes in domestic violence calls, your customer is actually the potential suspect, and you'll want to know that. Next thing is, are you able to talk to the victim about what happened, or do you need to keep the conversation about educating them on what's going to happen next and talking to them about their emotions? Typically, our role is not to talk to them about the actual events of what occurred. That is considered evidence, whatever they witnessed and whatever they have to offer. So remember to keep your conversation to educating them on what's going to happen next, what the police role is, why it's taking so long maybe for the investigation to take place in their eyes. And stay away from what happened, tell me what you saw type of questions. Next is if there's something that a victim or witness says to you that you believe could help in the investigation, you want to make sure that you stop the victim mid-sentence if need be and ask them if they shared that information with an officer. If they have not, you want to make sure that you connect them up with the officer before they share any additional information with you. Again, it could be part of the investigation, and it could make you a potential witness if they share the information. Once you've made contact with the victim, it's important to introduce yourself again, explain to them your role, and explain to them that you are not able to talk to them about the events, but that you're there to support them and to explain what will be happening next. You may be on scene for quite a long time, so be prepared to be there for a while. One of the best things that you can do is, again, educate your victim on what's going to happen. Educate yourself on who's going to be coming, how long it's going to take a detective to possibly be there, so that you're normalizing the situation for the victim and witnesses on scene. Another frustrating thing for a lot of victims and witnesses is that they will be separated from each other after the event. That is common police practice, and it's important to be able to explain that to the victims and the witnesses so that they don't feel that they're being treated unfairly. Again, it's part of preserving the crime. Finally, your last role when you're on scene is to make sure that the victim understands what their victim's rights are. Try to hook them up with victim advocates for longer-term assistance. Make sure that they're aware of victim compensation, how do they apply for it, and what services that it can potentially help pay for. And then any other resources that may be of assistance, such as finding a shelter, again, hooking them up with a victim advocate, explaining basic trauma responses, not only for the victim, but if there are children involved, responses that the children that may have that are common and normal, so that when the family sees those responses, they're not upset by them.
Even though strangulation and suffocation are life-threatening and now considered a felony, evidence of these acts is often overlooked at the crime scene.
In the next segment, we will outline the signs, symptoms, and lethality of strangulation and suffocation cases. We will also cover the documentation needed for successful prosecution.
In domestic violence, there are many serious crimes that are addressed. One of them that has not been at the forefront up until recently is the area of strangulation and suffocation. It is a crime that in the past has just been treated as a slap in the face, because quite often all that would ever be there would be redness to the neck. And just as someone would get slapped in the face and was not prosecuted or addressed in a proper manner. The proper investigation of these type of cases start at the first responder level. In fact, since we know and understand an abused victim will quite often recant their story or not want to show up, we have to make strides to go beyond that, to not put our victims in the position where they have to make the case, that we as police officers, as first responders, make that case and do things that can help our investigation. When investigating strangulation cases, we need to always remember, we need to ask the right questions. We need to document our evidence. We need to take many photos. The first thing you're going to encounter is probably your victim. And if they're calling the police, it's probably going to be the one time, for sure, that you're going to be able to get an interview from them. we might not get a second opportunity to talk to that victim. So using techniques such as audio taping your interviews. As a first responder, we realize that our victims later on recant their story or refuse to testify. It is for that reason it's imperative that we audio tape our interviews so that we have an audio tape for the jury to hear, so they have the opportunity to hear how that victim responded that night and what happened to her. Having them demonstrate what happened to them is key. A demonstration is very powerful evidence. When investigating strangulation cases, quite often your victim will refer to themselves as being choked. Medically, choking is having obstruction stuck into the throat, which usually you've heard of the Heimlich maneuver to remove it. But we don't need to get caught up on verbiage. Have them self-define what they mean by choking. Ma'am, what do you mean when you were choked? And if she explains to you, well, he put his both hands around my neck and squeezed and I couldn't breathe, then document that that was her definition of choking and move forward. As law enforcement professionals, we want to use the term strangulation when we're documenting our reports. You might want to lean towards looking to injury towards the neck as your primary way of documenting injury, but there's so much more than that. There are elements from the person's voice. Are they able to swallow, or do they do that with discomfort? Is their voice hoarse? Are they hyperventilating? Do they have petechiae, which are small dots in the eyes, on the eyelids, on the face, or anywhere above the area of trauma? Have you ever bothered to look behind the ears of your victim for bruising? You need to understand that when someone is being strangled, that it's not uncommon for them to involuntarily urinate or defecate. It's an embarrassing question to ask, and quite often, if they've called police and they have time to change, more often than not, they are going to change. It's imperative that you as a first responder ask those questions. They're not easy to ask, but you must ask them. So that if they do say, yes, I did, and I have the soiled clothing in my bedroom, or I put it in the washing machine, you need to go there, take photos of that. It is evidence. They look at it as embarrassment. You need to look at it as one more sign or symptom of someone who has been strangled. An Arizona law for aggravated assault that has been passed addresses strangulation and suffocation. It talks about a person's breathing and or blood circulation being impeded. You might ask yourself, if I have to prove in a court of law someone's blood circulation was impeded, how would I do that? One of the things that we look for is petechiae. Petechiae are small red dots found above the area of strangulation that develop because of pressure that is trapped inside the head. When someone is squeezing your neck, most often the jugular veins are closed off. The jugular veins stop the flow of deoxygenated blood from the brain and causes a backup because blood is still being pumped into the brain. And because of this pressure, capillaries and blood vessels in the eyes and around and above the area of strangulation have these little red spots. These are spots you need to look for, and you definitely need to photograph. When investigating strangulation cases, it is not uncommon to see abrasions and contusions to the neck. We often think that that was done by the suspect, when more times than not, injuries to the neck are caused by the victims defending themselves. As the suspect has their hands or arms or any device around their neck, the first response from the victim is to want to breathe, bringing the hands up to the neck to grab onto whatever mechanism or device they have and pull it away. And more times than not, it's the fingernails of our victim that cause that injury to their neck, which is evidence for us to photograph and use in court to show that this person, while being strangled, was trying desperately to get away and was trying desperately to breathe. We need to understand that it doesn't take much pressure to cut off circulation to the head. In fact, it takes very little. Some of the things police officers do in an everyday life, as far as going to the range when they pull the trigger on their gun, it's 3 to 6 pounds of pressure When someone opens a can of soda pop, that's about 20 pounds of pressure, double of what's needed to cut off the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain. It is important that you ask the right questions to your victims. You need to ask them, has this ever happened to you before? When this did happen to you, did he use one hand or two? Were you able to breathe? What did he say to you as he was strangling you? These are just some of the questions you want to make sure you're asking your victim, because your mission is to be able to create a vision for that judge and that jury to understand what was happening to her on that day or that evening when she was strangled. One area that officers often overlook are our dispatchers. As officers on the road, we don't hear the call coming in. What we hear is our dispatcher telling us where to go, what's going on, and trying to give us the most information as possible. After the call is over, I would urge you to call your dispatcher or the call taker and ask them, what did they hear? Have them play it for you. Better yet, get a copy of that for evidence. Many times you will hear statements from a victim or suspect dictating how it was being done, what they were trying to do, or what was being done to them. You get that in real time, at the moment, and with all of the excitement and stress and trauma that is currently going on during that incident. When encountering strangulation cases, we need to remember some principles. Number one, we need effective interviews. We need to be asking the victim the right questions as to what happened that evening or that day. We need to look for and identify the evidence on her body, injuries, statements that she made, and document them. If it's evidence, impound it. If a mechanism was used, photograph it and impound it. If a photograph is worth 1,000 words, then why aren't we taking a lot of them? When we put all these things together, we holistically can break the cycle of violence and increase the likelihood of successful prosecutions as it pertains to strangulation cases.
Every year, more than 12,000 children witness violence in their homes. In many cases, they are the only witnesses. If interviewed appropriately, they can provide powerful evidence that can be used to keep themselves and their families safe in the future.
In this segment, a forensic interviewer from Child Help Children's Center will offer an overview of the interview process and provide tips on speaking with children who have witnessed domestic violence.
So the first thing someone would do when they get to a scene where there's a domestic violence situation is they would take a look at the situation, assess who the witnesses would be, and if there is a child who has seen the episode occur, and if the child needs to be interviewed, you'd have to decide first whether you need a forensic interviewer. And some things that would require you to have a forensic interviewer would be if the child is, for say, let's say 6 or under, or if the child has developmental delays, or if there is a chronic history of abuse, or if the detective doesn't have the advanced forensic interview training. So once that happens, then the child can be brought down to an advocacy center. And it is a partnership between various agencies. One would be law enforcement, child protective services, therapists, forensic medical teams, and us interviewers. So once that happens, then the information is received from the supportive parent. That could be whoever is the non-offending parent or support or caregiver. So once that happens, you sit down and you talk and you get a history of the family, kind of a social history. Has this happened before? What has this child been exposed to? Are there any drugs or alcohol in the home? Any history of behavioral problems with the child or any developmental delays? So we call it the parent interview. So once the parent interview happens, then what I would do is take the child into an interview room. It's just me and the child in there. There aren't really toys. There's a stuffed animal like a teddy bear or some paper and crayons in case the child needs to be focused on one activity while we're talking. And then the detective would be in a monitor room and they would be watching the interview live. So the first thing when you sit down with the child is you build and establish rapport. It is a very critical part of the interview. It kind of sets the stage. So a couple of things that you would get as the interviewer in the rapport building would be how the child communicates. So let's say you ask the child a question and the child needs a very long time to respond, whether it is processing the information, allowing the child that time to communicate in their own style. So it'll allow you to see if the child will give you one-word answers, if they will give you an elaborate narrative of something that has occurred, a neutral topic. Typically what I do is tell me about your very last birthday and everything that happened. Tell me what you do at school from beginning to end. So you want to know if a child at the beginning can tell you a story, the beginning, the middle, and the end in sequence, and how much help the interviewer needs or how much structure. And so then we go through rules, and there's 4 rules that I always go through. And if the child's age 5 to 8, then we would practice these rules. But the very first one is if I ask the child a question and they don't understand what I mean, it's okay to stop me and say, hey, I don't get that, and then I'll figure out a different way to say it. And then we practice that. And then the next thing that I do is I tell them that if I ask them a question and they don't know the answer to it, that it's okay for them to tell me that they don't know, because it's really important that children don't guess during the interview. I want them to only tell me what it is they know, they saw, they heard, they felt, things like that. Then another one is if I make a mistake, it's really important for the child to stop me and tell me right away. And sometimes children really struggle with this, particularly with adults, because maybe they're taught you do what the adult says, or you don't correct adults because it's rude or what have you. Well, in the interview, it's really important that they're able to do that with me. And the final thing would be, as far as the rules go, would be what we call truth induction. And so what we would say to them is, if while we're in here today, it's really important that we only talk about things that really happened. Will you promise to tell the truth today? Because we've realized that that is way more effective by asking a child to promise to tell the truth than trying to figure out whether a child knows the difference between a truth or a lie, which can be, for young kids, particularly preschool, a very abstract idea. So a young child might not be able to define what a truth or a lie is, but it doesn't mean that they can't provide you accurate, truthful information. So once that rapport building occurs, then I would switch to the topic of concern. So I would say, how come you came to see me today? Well, I saw this happen. Tell me everything that happened that you saw. And then have the child go through the beginning, the middle, and the end of whatever occurred. And let the child just talk. That free narrative that the child will give you right away is the most accurate information. The younger the child, the more difficult it would be for them to provide. It might be woefully incomplete, but that's when you go back as the interviewer and you ask them more direct questions. And you say, where were you when that happened? What did you see? What did you feel? What did you hear? If they need that structure from the interviewer. So once you do that, then, because it's really important that we get episodes of events. So we don't want the child to go into script memory, which is very common, particularly for younger children. So an example of that would be, of script memory, is asking someone, tell me everything that you do at church. And if they come back to you and they say, well, we normally go into church, I talk with friends, I sit in the pew, we listen to the preacher, and what have you. So to get away from what happens most often in each event, tell me about the very last time this happened. Tell me about the first time. Tell me about the time you remember most clearly. Tell me about the time where you were frightened. To get individual events. So once you go through that and you do the some direct questions, if you need some clarification on some details or maybe definitions of things for the from the child's point of view, then you would go generally kind of the beginning of the closing of the topic of concern is there something else you would like me to know? If there was a time when I had more questions for you, or there was something else you wanted to tell me, would you come back and talk with me on a different day? And then after that, you would do the neutral closure, and you would say something like, what do you like to do for fun? Or what are you going to do when you leave here? What did you do this past summer? So to summarize this experience, the first thing you would need to do is on scene assess the situation. Is there a need for a forensic interviewer to be called in to interview this child? The next thing you would do is bring the child to an advocacy center where it is very child-friendly, there's a big playroom, it's very comfortable. So it doesn't look like a police department or a hospital, or the child doesn't have to go to various locations. The next thing would be to do a parent interview, or for the non-supportive parent, I would talk to the interviewer. I would talk to the parent. And so then you would take the child into the interview room, and you would go from the rapport building phase to the topic of concern to the neutral closure. And then once that occurs, then the child can return to the playroom, they can relax and get off that topic of concern, and then the detective or the law enforcement agency would take the investigation the rest of the way. So really the point of this process is to have the least amount of traumatizing interactions that the child would have with our various law enforcement agencies or entities that come into play during these types of investigations. Because what we've seen in research, in just experience at the centers, at our advocacy centers, is if we don't get this stuff right away, if we don't intervene right away and try to get information about what this child has experienced and get interventions, whether it's counseling or whether it's classes, and that doesn't mean just the child, it also means the parent, it also means the abuser, because we really don't want these children to end up being abusers themselves. So we really need to teach them how to have healthy, appropriate relationships with others so that they don't turn into abusers when they get to be adults.
In 2011, law enforcement agencies across the state trained their field officers to administer a simple lethality screen with domestic violence victims. Victims determined as high risk are connected to a 24-hour domestic violence hotline for immediate safety planning and follow-up.
Our final segment provides a description of a lethality assessment. While this tool is not included in the protocol model, it is in this video to demonstrate its potential value.
Can we shoot it? Can we drive it fast? Is it ballistic? No, it's not. It's a survey, and I think by and large in law enforcement we think about surveys and asking questions and things of that nature from a survey standpoint is something that's not really our job. That's the social services agency's job. But the fact of the matter is most people involved in domestic violence do not avail themselves to the services of social service agencies. And by far, of the 1,500 domestic violence incidents that occur every year in our nation, more than half of those, law enforcement has been on the scene and been in contact with the victim of those fatalities prior to the fatality being conducted or occurring. So what that says is who has more opportunity to be able to intervene and to offer social services, domestic violence advocacy information, and to be able to put people in touch.
The Domestic Violence Lethality Assessment Program is a program that's developed out of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence in collaboration with Dr. Jacqueline Campbell from Johns Hopkins University. The idea of the assessment is a very simple tool that law enforcement can use when they are on the scene working with domestic violence victims to assess the danger and lethality that that victim is potentially in. And if they score into a high lethality situation, to immediately connect those victims with services through a domestic violence service organization in your community. It's a collaboration then between the law enforcement agency and a nonprofit domestic violence 24-hour hotline. The goals of the program are very simple, which is to help law enforcement have a tool to help them identify victims that are at high risk and try to keep those victims safer, while simultaneously giving law enforcement a tool to potentially break that cycle of violence so that they are not called out repeatedly to the same household over and over again. On the victim side, it's to help victims realize and understand the danger that they're potentially in. Many domestic violence victims, as you know, live in this situation for months or years and become very accustomed to it and don't necessarily recognize the danger that they could be in. So helping those victims identify and begin to recognize that danger puts them in a greater potential to be able to reach out for help. And having an officer there that immediately connects those victims to a 24-hour crisis line ensures that there's a greater likelihood that those victims are going to access services.
This is one of those tools that isn't bright and shiny. It doesn't shoot any projectiles, and you know, it's not a taser or one of those other types of things that we may use in our profession that we think of as a tool to help prevent crime. But it is absolutely a tool that, in my assessment and my understanding of it, and utilizing in our department now for several months, that is something that is absolutely applicable to what we do each and every day. It is at the very heart and core of what law enforcement is supposed to be about.
The instrument itself is a very simple 11-question instrument that was developed, as I mentioned, from Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's larger 20-question danger assessment. It's an instrument that has been tested for reliability and validity so that we know that these 11 indicators are strong indicators of great risk for women in the potential for being murdered by their significant other. It's an instrument that should only be used in intimate partner domestic violence situations. The officer goes down the list of questions one by one and asks all 11 questions. The first 3 questions, if they receive a yes answer from the victim to any of the first 3 questions, they are automatically screened in as high risk. Questions 4 through 11 are then questions where they have to score 4 yes answers out of those next 7 questions in order to screen in as high lethality risk. But one of the great things about this tool is that officers at any time on their own can screen a victim in if their gut is telling them that this victim, this woman, is at higher risk for being in danger of being killed. The questions. The first 3 questions are, has he or she ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Has he or she threatened to kill you or your children? Do you think he or she might try to kill you? Victims who answer yes to any of the first 3 questions in the lethality screen are automatically screened in as high lethality risk. The officer will continue to ask the other questions, but he or she knows that that victim is at greater risk for potentially being killed by his or her partner, and thus will immediately, after completing those questions, contact the Domestic Violence Service Organization by phone and get the victim to speak to somebody. The next 7 questions, questions 4 through 11, are, does he or she have a gun, or can he or she get one easily? Has he or she ever tried to choke you? Is he or she violently or constantly jealous, or does he or she control most of your daily activities? Have you left him or her or separated after living together or being married? Is he or she unemployed? Has he or she ever tried to kill himself or herself? Do you have a child that he or she knows is not his or hers? And finally, does he or she follow or spy on you or leave threatening messages? If a victim answers 4 yeses to any of those 7 questions, that victim is automatically screened in as high lethality risk. For what we know is that women who answer yeses to any 4 of those questions are at much higher risk of potentially being killed by their intimate partner. So after finishing those questions, if they answer yes to any of the first 3, or 4 yeses to any of the subsequent 7 questions, the officer knows that that victim is at much higher risk.
Police officers survive on their gut feelings. That's how they stay safe. When they get to these situations, they have a feeling above and beyond the things that are said, the things that they see, the collection of all of those circumstances, and they have a gut feeling that they know that something is wrong, and they can elevate that and assess that and know that there's a higher level of risk and danger in this particular situation. An officer can screen that victim in just based on the gut feeling. Because officers have that intuition, they know, they respond back to those kinds of things regularly.
The idea is once you screen a victim in as high, then you immediately contact the Domestic Violence 24-hour hotline to get that victim connected to speak with a hotline worker. The idea there is that the hotline worker is specifically trained on this instrument so that he or she can begin working with that victim to do immediate, short safety planning and get that victim tied into services later by setting up a follow-up appointment. And the next step of the protocol is for the officer to call the domestic violence hotline and speak directly to a worker there and go over the list of those questions and let the worker know which yes answers that victim had. The goal is to get the victim to be willing to speak to the domestic violence hotline worker. For what we know is that when victims begin to access services, they are at a much greater likelihood of eventually breaking that cycle and leaving their abuser. Getting to safety is paramount.
In my estimation, this is one of those great tools that we can utilize in law enforcement. We've been using it in Marana now for about 3 months, and in fact, in the very first week, a great success story. We had an officer who went through the survey, asked the 11 questions of the victim. The victim responded, met the criteria to be referred to Emerge, which is our domestic advocacy group in Tucson. And so the victim was able to talk to an actual counselor right then and there on the phone. The counselor was able to get some assistance to that individual. And so a success story, a situation now where law enforcement will never have to respond to that particular address, to that location, to deal with domestic violence again. So it is one of those things that helps us prevent crime. It helps reduce the number of times we're responding to calls for service related to domestic violence. And most importantly, it provides opportunities for us to break the cycle of violence that keeps those 1,500 homicides a year related to domestic violence from occurring.
Communities that are interested in implementing the Domestic Violence Lethality Assessment Program should reach out to the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. They have a very specialized training program where they come out and do a 2-day training in communities. The first day of that training is designed for the senior leadership of the law enforcement agency and the Domestic Violence Service Organization to get commitments on how they're going to implement the Domestic Violence Lethality Assessment Program in their community and make sure that all the players understand how that program is going to work. The second day is a Train the Trainer program that is specifically designed for those people in the agencies who are going to conduct the training with the officers and the line staff in the Domestic Violence Service Organization. That training is set up to really provide those trainers with the skills and knowledge and background that they need in order to take that training on their own and make sure that all of the officers and the domestic violence service providers have the basic core understanding of how the instrument works and how to implement it.
This is a very, very important tool that will require officers just a few extra minutes of time that will give us another tool that we can refer a victim and intervene in acts of domestic violence that will give her added support and an added avenue of a way out and take steps to protect her and intervene in that cycle of violence that may save her life or the life of someone else.
From a chief of police standpoint, philosophically speaking, when we start looking at the prevention of crime, this is a great tool. And does it take a little bit of time on our part? Does it take some effort on the part of the officers that are involved? Absolutely it does. But it's time well spent, and here's why it's time well spent. Because anytime we have the opportunity to go in and intervene and break the cycle of violence, we need to be able to do that because that's our job. We're there to help people. We are public servants. And yeah, we like the other titles, law enforcement. We love going out there and arresting people and putting them in jail. We love the titles of public safety, and we love the title of peace officer, showing up on the scene, driving fast, shots fired calls. We're getting there as quick as we can, and because that's who we are and that's what we do. But also a big part of who we are and what we do is ensuring safety amongst all of our residents. Year-round, there are more than 3 homicides that occur every day related to domestic violence, over 1,500 homicides a year that are domestic violence related. And if we are able to intervene there, we have a better chance of reducing homicides directly related to domestic violence. And of course, who has more contact with domestic violence victims than any other groups, agency, whatever you may want to look at it as, but law enforcement. We are the people that are out there day in and day out responding to domestic violence calls. And where we have the opportunity to take a tool that is 11 questions long and ask these people very simple yes or no questions that can indicate and predict if they are at danger, at high risk of being a victim of domestic violence, then we need to be able to do that. And this is one of those tools that can clearly give us that opportunity.
Thank you to all of our trainers. Today we only explored 4 of 28 recommendations for responding to misdemeanor domestic violence crimes. We encourage you to check out the remaining recommendations.
The entire list or protocol model is available on our website at www.azmag.gov. Click on Projects at the top of the page, then look under the Human Services tab for the Domestic Violence Protocol Evaluation Project.
Thank you, Renee and Jason, and thank you to all the community partners highlighted in today's training segments. And for those of you on the front lines, thank you for all the work you do every day.
By coordinating a more consistent response to domestic violence, we can have more of an impact on keeping victims safe and holding abusers accountable.
Implementing these successful practices can also result in a cost savings to your community that may be reinvested in other necessary areas.
In the end, our work is about delivering justice. Implementing these practices will help us achieve that goal.